Good evening, everyone. Tonight we'll be continuing our studies in the book of Joshua and also being ready for Lads to Leaders, which is coming up in a few weeks. Last week and the weeks in the previous weeks, we've been looking over from I believe it was in chapter 6, I believe. Yeah, chapter 6 was when they first started their conquest towards Canaan. First city they took over was Jericho, and then the city after that they went into Ai. First time it didn't work out for them very well, and then the second time around when they took care of their sin, then that's when they were able to go back a second time and be able to conquer Ai. Last week, what we heard was when Gideon decided to make a peace treaty with Joshua and the Israelites, and it went pretty well, and it was peaceful there. This week for Joshua 10, this is the difference from here than the others is that not only was God on their side and helped them with their victories, but also God here will basically take part in the battle, and not only will the battle here God take charge of the battle here, but in the book of Judges, you'll see a few times where God basically intervenes, and basically the Israelite army didn't have to really fight but in this case they fought a little, but God took care of most of the work here. Going in, starting in chapter 10, verses 1 through 5, I'll be reading verses 1 through 5. Now it came to pass when Adoni-Zedek, king of Jerusalem, heard how Joshua had taken Ai and had utterly destroyed it, as he had done to Jericho and its king, so he had done to Ai and its king, and how the inhabitants of Gibeon had made peace with Israel and were among them, that they feared greatly, because Gibeon was a great city, like one of the royal cities, and because it was greater than Ai, and all its men were mighty. Therefore Adoni-Zedek, king of Jerusalem, sent to Hoam, king of Hebron, Piram, king of Jarmuth, Japhi, king of Lachish, and Deber, king of Eglon, said, "Come up to me and help me, that we may attack Gibeon, for it has made peace with Joshua and with the children of Israel." Therefore the 5 kings of the Amorites, the king of Jerusalem, the king of Hebron, the king of Jarmuth, the king of Lachish, and the king of Eglon, gathered together, went up they and all their armies, and camped before Gideon, and made war against it. Then I pulled up a map here. Pulled up a map here. So the Israelites crossed the Jordan River here, and then went in and conquered Jericho and destroyed everything there, and spared Rahab and her family. And then after that, they traveled to Ai and conquered this area. Failed the first time, but then came back and retried the second time. And then they came over here, and as we saw last week, they made peace with Gideon. And tonight we'll be going over these areas where basically Joshua takes care of the southern region. So their focus is main here. So throughout we'll be going over this map to tell where they are and what they were doing in that region. And in Joshua 1, in verse 1, we notice that the king of Jerusalem is mentioned here because of its importance to the region. And I believe in the future, city would serve basically as the main headquarters of the Israelite nation, and also the capital of Judah during the time of the split. Basically everything in Jerusalem is very important at this time. And I noticed from my footnotes here, or from my notes here, that Adoni-Zedek, the king of Jerusalem, has 2 possible meanings. first one means my Lord is righteous, and two, let's see, and two, Teked occurs with Melchizedek, king of Jerusalem, found in Genesis 14. This name was used throughout every succeeding nation of Jerusalem. It's very interesting how Jerusalem not only existed during this time, but it existed from the book of Genesis, and continues to be used throughout Israel's history. So basically, they wanted us to know how important this city was of conquering, since it was very advantageous for him. And then what we notice here is that the victory in Ai, everybody took notice of that, not only of Jericho, but they also took notice. And in verse 2 mentions that they feared greatly because of what they knew exactly what Israel was all about, and that they were pretty intimidating, and it was going to be a big fight if they were to get involved with them. And then once they heard about Gibeon, they realized that they were at a disadvantage, and so they came together, brought all the kings, their neighboring kings, around forgot to mention earlier that probably the first time they were defeated in Ai, they probably weren't as afraid, but once they figured out that they lost the second time around, then that's when they started taking notice there. As we saw last week, and as I said again, Gibeon was able to get into a peace treaty with Israel. And interesting thing about Gibeon is it's up north of Jerusalem, so up around here, is not too far away from them. But as you see here, Gibeon is basically like a trade route, a partner of Jerusalem. So you could see why they were very worried about Israel teaming up with Gibeon. And but it's dominating it's near the dominating plateau, providing a key strategic. Okay. As I said here, trade was basically one of the disadvantages if Gibeon was to team up with Israel, which Jerusalem and Gibeon worked really close together, and losing the trade here would hurt them economically, and also just they wouldn't be able to keep control of the region if they lost their trade here. So first thing that the reason why they were afraid of this treaty with Israel and Gideon was that. Then the next thing was it was like a key part of go through Jordan Valley of the East. But yeah, what worried them was not only trade, but also their communication networks was a biggest issue, because if they don't have anywhere to communicate with to the outside world, like from northeast and west, then then they wouldn't be able to allow everybody to know about what was going on with their region, and if they needed help or anything, then they wouldn't be able to communicate without Gibeon's help. And also they viewed Gibeon as mighty, suggesting that they were a war town, which they carried out their every need whenever they conquer or stop certain issues. But they went out and they were able to help help Jerusalem collect tribute from defeated enemies, but without their assistance, then they wouldn't be able to continue what they were doing around the region and making sure that all tribute was collected and that nobody tried to rebel or anything. So that was their biggest concern, why they formed a coalition between the southern region cities, and then they were afraid to lose their power within the region, because if they don't have Gibeon, then they lose much of their power to be able to control what they can control. But and then moving to the next part, these kings' names. These kings' names provided authentic forms and elements of Canaan between 1500 BC and 1200 BC. So these names were very familiar during this time, as it was pretty common for kings to pass down their legacies and their names down to their successors. Hebron, Lachish, and Eglon are towns formed south of Jerusalem. Jarmuth was modern-day Tel Yarmut, lay east of Jerusalem, between Sorek and Elah valleys that stretched east and west and formed access routes between the coastal plain and the area of Jerusalem. The kingdoms came together and realized Gibeon could be a threat to them, and so they decided to team up with Jerusalem and attack Gibeon, since they made the treaty with Israel, and they had to get control quick, or else they were going to lose everything they had in that region. And then during my footnote under the local towns and cities, noticed that the local towns and cities had their own militias to be able to protect themselves from anything that came against their communities or were a threat to them. But you'll see these throughout the book of Joshua until Israel took control and turned the region into a monarch, as we'll see more in 1st and 2nd Samuel of what the Israel monarch became to be. Before we move on to the next section, does anybody have any thoughts before we move on to the next one?
Just the fact that, Israel must have been a sizable army for the king of Jerusalem, round up all these confederates in their army. So, it was a sizable battle they were planning.
And then also when we get into it, we'll notice that there are some armies that don't side with any of these cities that decide to join with Israel to conquer and take over. So keep that in mind as we read through, and also they're also known as the local militias or city militias. Any other thoughts? Moving on to the next section, verses 6 through 10. Verse 6 through 10 reads, "And the men of Gibeon sent to Joshua at the camp at Gilgal, saying, 'Do not forsake your servants. Come up to us quickly, save us and help us, for all the kings of the Amorites who dwell in the mountains have gathered together against us.' So Joshua ascended from Gilgal, he and all the people of war with him, and all the mighty men of valor. And the Lord said to Joshua, 'Do not fear them, for I have delivered them into your hand. Not a man of them shall stand before you.' Joshua therefore came upon them suddenly, having marched all night from Gilgal. So the Lord routed them before Israel, killed them with a great slaughter at Gibeon, chased them along the road that goes to Beth Horon, and struck them down as far as Azekah and Makkedah, and it. Right. That's the first part of the battle. Basically, we see here. So next part here is they go from here all the way to the Jerusalem area and basically chase everybody out and corners them in around Beth Horon and in Zechariah in those areas. So they basically pushed them away from where they were supposed to. Here in verse 6, we see here not only did they have a peace treaty, they were given a sworn protection from their enemies. So basically, as tradition shows and what it was like back then, whenever you signed a peace treaty, not only are you giving peace towards the other side, but you also had to protect them from any invasion or any enemies that will want to take them down. And Gibeonites were afraid and relied on Israel. And good thing about Israel was they were not afraid to take on the challenge, as God was on their side. And then we see from verses 7 all the way to 43, this chapter is basically broken up into different perspective series of parts of the story. Like they go from this part to the next, or from this part of the story to this part, or in this case, they go from one city into the next. And as we'll notice, it's pretty rapid. Like it doesn't just happen in a couple of days. It happens like almost every day. They're going to the next city, destroying everything, and then once they destroyed everything, they just go on to the next city and conquer that. So it was pretty rapid.
I always thought that this was God's way of taking care of
All the armies almost at one time. He doesn't have to fight all these other wars. He's going to take the southern half of what we call Judah or Israel, basically in one big battle, all these skirmishes that we described. So God had a plan.
Yes. Not only did God have a plan, but he was there to help make sure that the Israelites execute what God's plan was. So he was there to make sure that it was being enforced, and also they overpowered their enemies. If you can see there, from 7 to 10, we see here is like a description of the story/summary of what took place during their fight with Jerusalem and the armies there. And basically what we see here, they just summarize this part just to set up to where they go from the top part of the south into and they advance towards the other cities. And as you see here, it was pretty fast-paced. They never slowed down. And then 11 through 15 describes the work of God as the leader of the battle, which God basically intervenes pretty much directly. And as it describes here, it was like a miracle, since Israel was basically alone against 5 other armies in Gibeon. So it wasn't like Israel had like a really huge army, but because God was on their side, they were able to take on these all 5 of these armies, and whether they had and then the allies of the 5 armies. And then 16 through 27 describes each battle with the towns in the Southern Coalition. 28 through 40 basically goes into more detail with that, and then we'll see in 41 through 43 is like a conclusion to the story of the conquering of the southern region, basically what would become later Judah. And then after going through that, and then what we notice here, that God always tells Joshua that not to fear what's ahead or the armies that he's about to conquer, that God will always be on his side. And then I thought this was. Then I noticed here one of the ways God's able to help the Israelites conquer an army. Sometimes, whether in Judges, with confusion or just causing a lot of chaos within the enemy armies. God's always able to give Israel the opportunity and help Israel find vulnerabilities within an enemy army to be able to conquer it, as long as they, of course, trust in God and not doubt or try to do it their own way. But it's really interesting how God likes to. The one thing He likes to do with enemy armies is always find a way to create confusion within it, so that they can't recover. At least they don't understand what's going on. So it gives Israel big opportunities with that. We'll see it throughout Israel when they go into battle, that there's always confusion or chaos, and there's always vulnerabilities. A good example was during Exodus, when God was able to create confusion within the Egyptians, which gave Israel time to maneuver away from the Egyptian army and be able to cross while they were stuck. They were stuck in flames, and everybody was scared. And then once they saw that the flames weren't there, they charged in. But then everybody was just confused, and they fell into the trap.
What about verse 7? When God hurled huge stones from heaven and hailstones and killed them.
We kill more with that than they killed with their sword.
Yes. Yeah.
It's just very interesting.
I was about to talk about that, but I think
sorry.
you're good. You're good. But yeah, we'd get more into that. I thought that was very fascinating on how He was able to help Israel overcome at least the rallying from Beth Horon to Zedek. I think
I'm
it's
just
Zedek.
telling you, if I get to pick between fighting through the sword or having God, so a hailstone from heaven. I take that.
Yeah. Yeah. I think hailstones is probably more effective.
Much finer.
The helmet was invented shortly after.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Give it the inspiration.
Yes. That's why we have hard hats nowadays. But oh yeah, son. I noticed in verse 11 they never talked about how big the hailstones were. They just said that they were hailstones. That.
Right. So they had it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then any final thoughts before we move on to the next section?
Verse 13, 12 and 13.
All right. Moving on, 11 through 15, as I described earlier, and we're about to get to the fun part with the hailstones. Starting in verse 11. Verse 11, and it happened as they fled before Israel and were on the descent of Beth Horon that the Lord cast down large hailstones from heaven on them as far as Azekah, and they died. There were more who died from the hailstones than the children of Israel killed with the sword. Then Joshua spoke to the Lord in the day when the Lord delivered up the Amorites before the children of Israel and said in the sight of Israel, Sun, stand still over Gibeon, and moon in the valley of Jalon. So the sun stood still, and the moon stopped, till the people had revenge upon their enemies. Is this not written in the book of Jashar? So the sun stood still in the midst of heaven, and did not hasten to go down for about a whole day. And there had been no day like that, before it or after it, that the Lord heeded the voice of a man, for the Lord fought for Israel. Then Joshua returned, and all Israel with him, to the camp at Gilgal. And then as they got into Beth Horon and Azekah, as Hamilton was mentioning, God threw down large hailstones. We don't know how big they are, but they're probably big enough to kill somebody. But it was really interesting, and it really gave Israel an advantage to be able to move forward, as basically they took out quite a lot there. And getting into it, up here, God probably threw really big hailstones. If I had to estimate, it'd probably be as big as football or even bigger. But they were pretty big enough. It says here that it was big enough to kill somebody. So.
Can't you just see behind the scenes the commander of the Lord's army doing all this? I mean, you don't realize the spiritual world that we're within, but, whether it be the hailstones, whether it be all of a sudden Jericho, the walls falling together. I mean, God's all around us. He has all his angels working, it's not necessarily miraculous today, but, there's a battle, and we know it's happening right here, commander of the Lord's army. I just think it's just fascinating.
Yes. I agree with that. It was pretty fascinating that God was able to take on a full army with just hailstones, as long as the Israelites, of course, believed and didn't go against God's command. God was able to do something like this as long as they believed and didn't go against what God wanted or was wanting them to do. But yes.
When I was in service on Station Fort Riley, Kansas, we had a hailstorm up there, and out at the lake, right outside of Manhattan. We lived in Manhattan. But the lake that was there were a lot of people camping. Every trailer that was out there was absolutely destroyed.
Oof.
There, and the hailstones, they said, were some of the smaller ones was like baseballs. Some of the bigger ones was softball and bigger. And I've seen some golf ball size that, and one of them gets you, it rained a knot on your head for sure. But they filled up the hospital in Manhattan with people that were hurt. They filled it up completely and started bringing them out to the Army hospital out on base from people that was hurt. But every trailer that was out there, every car, truck that was out there was absolutely demolished. I can see how it could happen. Get you out in the open.
Yes. And out of surprise, because hail doesn't tell you when it's coming. It just comes right down.
I'm sure it was kind of a surprise.
Mhm.
It may not even be cloudy for all we know.
Yeah. I mean, as we saw in verse 12 through 13, basically when Joshua asked for the moon and the sun to stay still, it stood still, and I don't think the army knew about it until it was too late. So it could have been not cloudy. And with the miraculous work of God, he was able to make hailstones come out without any clouds.
This is one of those verses, one of those sections, where people say, all right, I'm with you so far,
Yeah.
but now I quit. And the verbiage said, the Lord threw down the great stones from heaven. And people have the image of, Zeus throwing out lightning bolts.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Of course, that's imagery speaking. But the people of faith, this isn't a problem. We're talking about the God that spoke matter into existence, that created everything. So a hailstorm, nothing for him.
No.
Or holding the sun still, scientifically, physically impossible, and yet he did it.
Yeah.
So it's one of those demarcation verses. Do I go further and believe in faith, or do I stop here and say it's all fairy tale?
Depends on who you are, and if you want to believe this isn't possible, then you'll have to believe that. But if you believe that God is powerful and can do anything, it works there. But and then next part after the hailstone, Joshua here basically prays to God and asks, "Can you keep the sun stood still and also the moon, and or the sun to stay over Gibeon over here, and then put the moon over here and leave it there?" And with Joshua's faith here, God was able to keep the sun still and the moon still. Thought it was very interesting that Joshua would want this, but it was pretty strategic. It helped them strategically be able to overcome their enemies that were in the region. But basically, they were able to overpower them and be able to take over there. Then I noticed they talked about the book of Jashar. I don't believe we have the book of Jashar today, but it was also mentioned in 2 Samuel 1:18, which 1:18 was about the part of the genealogy behind David and King Saul and Jonathan. Talked about their families, but probably the reason why Joshua is not here today is because it probably wasn't very important, at least to us today. If it was important, God would have made sure that we had it today. But just like any other books that we don't have today, but were mentioned in the scriptures, some of them weren't important enough to be kept, or with God's divine power, he didn't think it was very important to keep. But God did most of the fighting for Israel before God allowed Israel to get into battle. But most of the battle was won through God and His miraculous events. We see here that if God didn't take part in this, there would have been no way Israel would have been able to take over these cities. And just for time's sake, move on to the next section. For here, I just did a summary since it's a long read, so you can follow along on your own, but did a little summary here. Basically, 16 through 17, the 5 kings were seen fleeing before the end of the battle. They probably thought they were finished, so they just fled to a cave at Makkedah. 18 through 20 shows that Joshua was informed that the kings were hiding in the cave, and he decided to have at least one guard positioned at the cave, and then he ordered the army to pursue any enemy armies, make sure that they didn't get to the fortified centers, to regroup and to help their kings out. They didn't want them escaping, so they charged at them and made sure to put them down. And then from the rest of the text, we see the destruction of the fortified centers. So they basically destroyed all those places. And then 21 mentions that Israel was to be feared. It was like the biggest thing that God wanted us to take from this was to have fear of Israel, because they were coming in and making sure that everything was destroyed. And then I'll read 22 through 24. Then Joshua said, "Open the mouth of the cave and bring out those 5 kings to me from the cave." And they did so and brought out those 5 kings to him from the cave: the king of Jerusalem, the king of Hebron, the king of Jarmuth, the king of Lachish, and the king of Eglon. So it was, when they brought out those kings to Joshua, that Joshua called for all the men of Israel and said to the captains of the men of war who went with them, "Come near, put your feet on the necks of these kings." And they drew near and put their feet on their necks. And what we see here is they did everything they obeyed God word for word. Basically, this was like the time they decided, all right, we guarded them, let's take them all out and get ready to do what make sure that we place them in a position that shows that Israel's powerful than these kings. Then the next couple of verses go into basically the execution of the kings, and basically they did the same way they did to the Ai king, which was captured him and then hung him from a tree and then took him down before nightfall and then buried him, as Jewish tradition said that they were supposed to do this. And the interesting thing was it conclude this 27 talks about how he did this the same way as he did with Jericho and Ai, or as an Ai. And then as you see the loop there, just for time's sake, we'll move forward. Basically, they kept them under guard, and then captains. When the captains were told to place their feet on the neck of the kings, it showed subjugation of the kings and to their rule, and shows them that they're stronger than the king's rule, and that the armies of Israel are strong. And basically, as Joshua did from Ai, there. Then moving along into Joshua 28 through 40. To summarize, 28 shows the destruction of Makkedah and they left no survivors. We'll get into that. No survivors next. 29 through 30 was the destruction of Libnah. Lachish was 31 through 33. Eglon was 34 through 35. Hebron 36 through 37, and Debir 38 through 39, all followed in rapid sequence, as I mentioned earlier. And basically the last, and then verse 40 is just a summary of everything they did. And then as you see there, they took over the whole southern region. What we get from each, it was done rapidly. After they destroyed a city, then they went to the next, and next, until they conquered it all. In 33, we see Gezer mentioned, but it was an army that provided Israel with assistance. As I mentioned back, it was like a town militia. It was a town militia. They were able to help Israel take over Lachish. There's probably others. It wasn't mentioned, but they thought Gezer was very important to mention. The importance of Lachish was that it was basically a base for Egypt's empire, like their influence in southern Canaan. When they took over it, then Egypt's influence went away. When they say none remaining, they didn't mean literally nobody existed. It was more of it meant that they were not as many as before, so it was a smaller number. As you'll see in chapter 13, that there were still some Canaanites still living amongst the Israelites, and in Judges 1, you'll see more of Canaan. And then 41 through 43 was I won't read that as running out of time. These last verses are a summary and ends the section of conquering the southern cities of Canaan, and what we'll know as when God divides everything, this region would go to Judah, and would be very important throughout Israel's history, and to the kings of Israel. Goshen, mentioned in verses 42 and 43, was an unknown region. Wasn't owned by Egypt, but was a region of its own. It, as I mentioned, with the whole southern side, Judah would own the land there. And then also in 43, if you notice throughout each section, they always ended their conquest by going back to Gilgal, which Gilgal was like their headquarters during their conquering of the land of Canaan. In conclusion, sometimes God will either answer us directly or indirectly, as long as we do what His will is and what He commands. He'll answer our prayers. He'll answer things in a direct way, but it won't be like in miracles. But sometimes He may bring an opportunity that looks like it's direct. Is pretty much directed or as we ask, and sometimes, but But yeah, if we allow God to come into our lives and to help us, and we talk to Him regularly, He'll answer our prayers. And but as long as we do as He commands, He'll return the favor. Thank you.
Verse 42.